An elderly man with a humble appearance and a weary walk enters a hospital looking for information. Ignored, mistreated, and humiliated by the head nurse, he endures a series of silent abuses until one cruel act crosses the line. What no one expected was that the old man wasn't there by chance. He was the new owner of the hospital, and his response to the injustice would forever change the culture of that place. The morning sun filtered through the hospital's glass windows, reflecting on the white walls and bustling corridors. Among hurried employees and impatient patients, a simply dressed elderly man crossed the main door with slow and careful steps, holding a worn-out hat in his hands. He observed every detail attentively, the decorative plants, the paintings, the notices on the bulletin boards, as if he recognized the place from within, even though he was treated as invisible. His gaze carried a rare serenity, but also a hint of fatigue. He walked to the reception without haste, waiting in silence for some sign of service. The attendant behind the counter typed noisily and didn't even look up. He coughed lightly to get attention, but all he received was the sound of a nail tapping the keyboard and the calculated indifference of someone who sees no value in those who do not appear to have it. After a few minutes standing, the man took a step forward and asked in a low but firm voice where he could get information about the new hospital wing. The attendant, still without taking her eyes off the screen, vaguely pointed toward the end of the corridor, as if pushing away a nuisance. There was no good morning, no explanation, just a lazy and impersonal gesture. He thanked her with an almost imperceptible nod and followed the indicated direction. Along the way, he tried to catch signs or plaques, but the confusion between wings and sectors only increased. He approached a uniformed employee passing by with papers. The man barely listened and already answered with a "that way," without stopping. The feeling was of being an intruder where he should be welcome. At the end of the corridor, he spotted a partially empty waiting bench and decided to sit for a few minutes to catch his breath. He had barely touched the seat when a harsh voice rose from the other side of the corridor. It was a nurse with a stern face and impatient expression who marched toward him with crossed arms. She stopped in front of him, as if she were dealing with a problem. Her eyes scanned his body from head to toe, focusing on the simple clothes, the worn-out shoes, the crumpled hat on his lap. He tried to explain his presence there, but she interrupted him with a curt gesture. Her voice, though low, carried contempt. He could not stay there without authorization. In the face of the nurse's posture, the elderly man remained calm. He stood up slowly, trying to move away, so as not to cause more commotion. But every movement of his seemed to irritate her even more. She passed him by, pushing the medication cart with unnecessary force, purposely brushing his shoulder, as if to make it clear he was in the way. As he discreetly walked away, he looked at a plaque in the corridor bearing a familiar name, his own. It was a newly inaugurated wing named in honor of the new investor. The old man smiled subtly, as one who recognizes the silent irony of fate. The hospital he had secretly purchased to improve service conditions was now treating him as a nuisance. But he knew this was just the beginning. Nurse Claudia observed the elderly man with narrowed eyes and a judgment-laden expression. To her, he was just another disoriented intruder, and his presence in a busy wing was a nuisance. Her impeccable uniform and rigid posture contrasted with the fragile figure of that man who seemed out of place. Without bothering to hide it, Claudia allowed her disdain to show in her gestures and glances. While filling out a form, she slightly tilted her head toward the elderly man, exchanging silent looks with colleagues who responded with barely contained smiles. Humanity there had already been replaced by an indifferent routine. The elderly man walked slowly down the corridor, paying attention to the signs and faces around him, trying to locate the new wing he knew existed in that hospital. Even among many, it was as if he were alone. No gaze lingered on him for more than a few seconds. Everyone passed by hurriedly, indifferent to his presence. He stopped in front of a wall where old photos were displayed, among them a black-and-white picture with his younger face. Time had greatly changed his appearance, but the history printed on those walls remained alive for those who knew how to see. And there, standing before his own past, he remained ignored. Without any sign of guidance, the elderly man sat on one of the corridor benches, his body asking for rest. He had barely touched the seat when Claudia appeared in the distance, altering her walking pace and hardening her expression even more. His quiet and peaceful presence was enough to trigger in her a distorted sense of authority. She approached with determined steps, carrying in her gaze the certainty that she was dealing with someone who didn't belong in that space. There was no analysis, no reflection. His humble appearance alone was reason enough for rejection. The bench where he rested became, for her, a symbol of invasion. Nearby patients noticed the commotion and averted their eyes, preferring the comfort of omission. The elderly man, though feeling the cold glances and hostile atmosphere around him, remained silent. His hands rested on his lap with serenity, and his eyes, watchful, absorbed every detail of that silent treatment. When the nurse walked away, still stiff in her posture, the elderly man stayed still for a few seconds, as if reflecting. He then rose slowly and resumed his walk, leaving behind not only the bench, but also the invisible mark of the judgment he had endured, a judgment that would soon come at a price. The elderly man had approached a partially empty room, trying to find his way through the corridors. The fatigue was evident in his slower steps and the slight tremble in his hands. When he reached a chair against the wall, he looked around before sitting down, like someone trying not to be a bother. A few meters away, Claudia watched him with impatient eyes. His mere presence in a more restricted circulation area seemed to inflame her irritation. To her, that man didn't represent vulnerability, but disorder. Her posture showed she would not tolerate it any longer. Without hesitation, Claudia crossed the corridor quickly and stopped in front of the elderly man, raising her body like a physical barrier. Her look carried a harshness that needed no words to be understood. In that moment, she no longer saw a human being, but an obstacle to the image she wanted to uphold. Faced with the tension, the elderly man stood up with effort, trying to step aside with dignity. His movements were slow, but still firm. His silence seemed to bother her more than any reaction. And the more he showed calm, the more her rigidity turned aggressive. When he turned to move on, the narrow corridor forced them to pass close to each other. The nurse, instead of giving way, stepped forward roughly. Her shoulder hit the old man's with unnecessary force, causing him to slightly lose balance. He leaned on the wall but did not fall. The shove was subtle to inattentive eyes, but it carried intention. A few steps ahead, Claudia adjusted her coat as if nothing had happened. The elderly man, now standing still, closed his eyes for a moment. Not out of weakness, but like someone who marks an inner limit, a line that had been crossed. The hostility was starting to draw the attention of other employees. A nursing technician watched the scene from a distance, hesitating between continuing on or intervening. Near the elevator, two patients paused their conversation upon noticing the tension, but quickly returned their eyes to their own concerns. The elderly man then stepped away from the wall with restrained firmness. His breathing was calm, but his stride was now different. There was determination in his walk. He left behind not just the corridor, but the certainty that respect wouldn't come from words, and that if recognition was needed, it would be on his terms. The elderly man walked through the main corridor toward the administrative sector with firm and silent steps. There was something different in his posture now, as if each movement had a purpose. The slowness that once suggested frailty now seemed to carry intention. The reception, which had previously ignored him, didn't even notice his exit. No employee stopped or questioned him. It was as if the hospital kept running on autopilot, unaware that something was about to change deeply. The silence around him was heavy, but not empty. Minutes later, an administrative supervisor walked hurriedly through the corridors, cell phone pressed to his ear and a tense expression on his face. Behind him, two members of the legal department appeared with folders in hand and serious looks. The sudden movement broke the staff's numbed routine. Employees began exchanging glances, noticing the unusual presence of suited professionals. A rising murmur echoed through the hallways, though no one yet understood what was happening. Nurse Claudia, absorbed in her tasks, barely noticed the shift in the atmosphere. In the second-floor meeting room, a group of managers gathered in a hurry. Documents were being organized, computers opened, urgent glances exchanged. A list of names was being reviewed hastily, and among them, the elderly man's name stood out. Meanwhile, on a monitor fixed to the reception wall, the image of the hospital's new sponsor played in silence. Most people passed by without noticing, but the name printed in the caption was the same now being spoken in hushed tones by those in high positions. The elderly man reappeared at the entrance to the central wing, now accompanied by two soberly dressed advisors. Their faces were discreet, but their movements revealed authority. Their presence changed the pace in the corridors. Footsteps slowed, eyes turned. The atmosphere grew tense. The man who had been ignored now held everyone's gaze, not out of pity, but uncertainty. The presence of important figures at his side raised silent questions among staff. That silence, once born of contempt, now carried fear. Something significant was about to happen. The clinical director appeared in the lobby accompanied by two visibly tense board members. They walked to the center of the hospital, where the elderly man awaited, surrounded by eyes filled with curiosity and discomfort. Their gestures were restrained, but reverent. Words weren't necessary, their posture said all. In a formal gesture, the director pointed to the elderly man and introduced him in a low tone to the assembled staff. His name now carried a different weight. The forgotten old man was not just another patient. He was the hospital's new majority owner, the man behind the recent merger that had quietly saved the institution from bankruptcy. Employees who previously avoided his eyes now searched the floor for excuses. Nurse Claudia, standing near the counter, felt her heart race as she realized the direction of the glances. She tried to maintain composure, but the color was already draining from her face. The name of that man echoed in her mind like a verdict. The once noisy environment suddenly fell silent. Devices kept beeping, footsteps echoed in the corridors, but no one in that wing spoke anymore. It was the kind of silence that precedes a turning point, where every second seems to anticipate the impact of something irreversible. The elderly man didn't raise his voice, didn't demand explanations, nor did he show any resentment. His gaze slowly scanned each face present. The surrounding silence seemed to bow to his presence, as if time itself had stopped to witness the reversal of everything that had happened in the previous hours. The nurse remained motionless, but the memory of her own actions began to weigh on her shoulders. It wasn't just fear of punishment, it was public shame, the collapse of the false authority she had used against someone she deemed too insignificant to matter. Now everything she had ignored stood before her immense. A discreet nod from the director was all it took. Two supervisors approached the nurse and quietly escorted her to a private room. The gesture wasn't accompanied by harsh words, but its firmness left no doubt. The consequence was inevitable. No one else needed to ask why. The elderly man remained standing at the center of the room, surrounded by faces that now watched him with respect. He hadn't asserted himself through titles or shouting, but through integrity and patience. What had once been invisible now became undeniable. And even without saying a single word, he had said everything. The following morning, an extraordinary meeting was called in the conference room. Managers, nurses, and technicians sat side by side, the atmosphere thick with expectation and restrained discomfort. The elderly man entered last, without fanfare, wearing the same sober blazer from a previous day, but now with unquestionable authority. He walked to the center of the room and slowly placed his hands on the table. Everyone's attention fixed on him. There was no haste in his gestures, nor theatricality in his presence. The atmosphere was one of attentive listening. Every gaze on him carried respect, but also the weight of personal conscience. With the presence of both administrative and clinical leaders, the elderly man signaled structural changes. A new code of conduct would be instituted, focusing on the dignity of all patients, regardless of appearance or condition. The words came through a document already prepared and signed by him that morning. The news quickly spread among staff. An integrity committee would be formed, and mandatory training on empathy and ethics would become part of the routine. The hospital began to reorganize, not only from within, but also within the people who composed it. Nurse Claudia, now formally suspended, awaited the outcome of the internal process. In her absence, the hospital's atmosphere had subtly shifted. The arrogance that once hovered in certain corridors was being replaced by more attentive gazes and genuinely caring gestures. The presence of the elderly man, even in silence, remained influential. Behind the scenes, some employees commented on the unexpected transformation of the man who arrived invisible and left revered. There was no room for irony, only reflection. He had touched something deeper than authority. He had reminded everyone of the essential purpose of that place. On Friday afternoon, the elderly man left the hospital through the same door he had entered days before. But the looks of the employees who watched him now were different. Doors were opened, heads bowed slightly, and respectful silence accompanied his departure. Outside, the sky was clear, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves of the front garden trees. He walked slowly to the parked car, but before getting in, he looked one last time at the hospital. There was no pride in his expression, only peace. The lesson had been given, not through imposition, but by example. Tell me what your rating for this story is from 0 to 10 in the comments, and we'll see each other in the next video that's on the screen.